In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it.
Welcome to tonight's episode of Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. I'm Stephen Lake. Tonight, cryptography for the people. Cryptography. What it is, what it does, how it can help us to a new world of privacy and freedom for every man. I smoke because it reminds me of impermanence. Smoke curls, dances, and disappears. It has no archive, no backup, no server farm in Utah holding its ghost. Once it's gone, it's gone. The tragedy is that the world doesn't work like that anymore. Secrets don't vanish. Every word, every moment, every transaction, every stumble, it's logged permanently. You leave fingerprints in 1,000 invisible places every time you pick up your phone. It's the end of forgetting. That used to be the foundation of freedom. Forgetting. A bad joke at a bar, forgotten the next morning. A youthful mistake, fading into obscurity. A romance, a heartbreak, a debt, a lie. All of it washed away by time. But time doesn't wash anything anymore. The cloud keeps it. The server hoards it. The algorithm remembers it, and it will weaponize what it remembers. That's why I'm actively building encrypted software with search engines that are privacy-centric, privacy-focused, that don't cache or store any information and are gone the second the user is done with it. And into that cage walks cryptography. Not as a toy, not as a trick, but as the last weapon that makes forgetting possible again. Cryptography is vanishing in mathematical form. It's a whisper that turns into gibberish unless you have the right key. It's smoke that refuses to be captured. That's what tonight is about, or this morning, or whenever you're listening, alone with your headphones, maybe walking down the street full of cameras, maybe scrolling on a device that's selling your soul one tap at a time. We're going to talk about cryptography, not the math, not the engineering, not the technical weeds. That's out there already. You can read it, watch it, study it. What I want to do with you is something else. To muse, to sit in the smoke, and to think about what cryptography means for culture, for society, for dignity, and for freedom. I want to stretch it out, not 10 minutes, not 20. An hour of slow burn, because that's what this subject deserves. We'll wander through the history, Romans, Arabs, Elizabethan spies, World War II machines. We'll dig into philosophy, Orwell, Foucault, Kafka. We'll drift into counterculture, hippies, hackers, cypherpunks. We'll walk into the future, AI, quantum computers, algorithmic constitutions, and eventually we'll ride at something radical, a thought experiment, but more than a thought, a possibility. Monarch X, my platform, a platform that could rewrite what governance means, a society built not on promises but proofs, a constitution that can't be burned, bribed, or ignored. That's where we're going. That's where we're going. But first, let's breathe in the smoke of history, because to understand why cryptography matters now, we need to understand why it's always been the secret language of power. Cryptography is older than computers, older than the NSA, older than Alan Turing. The Romans had their Caesar cipher. You take the alphabet, shift it by 3 letters, and suddenly your message to the legion is unreadable to the enemy. Simple by our standards, but back then, it was the difference between life and death. Secrets meant survival. Move forward to the Islamic Golden Age. Arab mathematicians refined cryptographic techniques, inventing new ciphers and, crucially, the science of breaking them. Al-Kindi wrote about frequency analysis, a method of cracking substitution codes by counting how often the letters appear. That was the birth of cryptanalysis, the paranoia that every secret can be unraveled. The Renaissance was dripping with secrets. Diplomats wrote in code. Spies carried letters filled with gibberish, only decipherable with a key. Elizabethan England used cryptography to protect Queen Elizabeth and expose the plots against her. Mary, Queen of Scots, thought her ciphers were safe. They weren't. Her encrypted letters were intercepted and cracked, and she was executed. A queen lost her head because her math wasn't strong enough. Then came the Enlightenment and the birth of modern nations. Thomas Jefferson tinkered with the cipher wheel, a series of rotating disks that could generate complex codes. He understood that secrets were statecraft, Napoleon's empire rose and fell on the strength of his couriers and the weakness of their ciphers. The American Civil War had its own encryption drama. The Union and Confederacy sent coded telegrams, scrambled with rudimentary systems. Some were broken, some weren't. Information decided battles. Then the 20th century turned paranoia into machinery. The Germans built Enigma, a typewriter fused with rotors and electricity. Every keystroke turned into a shifting, ever-changing code. To the naked eye, unbreakable. But Alan Turing and his team at Bletchley Park broke it with machines of their own. They cracked Enigma and shortened the war. Millions of lives saved or lost differently because of math. But here's what history books don't emphasize. Once the war ended, encryption did not become public knowledge. It became classified, locked up by the state. Strong cryptography was declared a weapon. Exporting it was like shipping guns or missiles. The state's logic was simple. Secrecy belongs upwards, not downwards. Generals, presidents, spy masters get it. You do not. This is the pattern. Cryptography had always been about who gets to keep secrets. Kings, priests, generals, never the people. The people's secrets were considered irrelevant or dangerous. But then came the personal computer, and with it, the possibility of ordinary people wielding cryptography for the first time in history. Suddenly, a kid in a basement could encrypt messages stronger than what governments had used a decade earlier. And that scared the hell out of the state. Thus began the crypto wars of the 1990s. The U.S. government tried to stop the spread of strong encryption. They proposed the Clippers chip, a backdoor in every device, so the state could always listen. They treated Phil Zimmermann, creator of Pretty Good Privacy, PGP, as a criminal. His software let ordinary people encrypt their emails. The government investigated him for exporting munitions. His crime? Sharing code on the internet. The motto of the cypherpunks became prophecy. If you outlaw encryption, only outlaws will have encryption. That's the turning point. That's when cryptography left the palace and the Pentagon and fell into the hands of the people. And ever since, the state has been trying to shove it back into the vault. But they can't, because once a secret leaks, it never goes back in. Once a tool exists, it spreads. And cryptography is the tool that makes secrecy democratic. That's why we're here. That's why you're listening. Because the history of cryptography isn't just a history of math. It's the history of power. And for the first time, power is slipping into the hands of ordinary people. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. The dull mantra of bureaucrats, police chiefs, corporate mouthpieces, and every authoritarian who ever smiled while tightening the noose. It sounds rational, it sounds clean, but it's poison wrapped in plain speech. Because what it really means is this: your life is not yours. Your inner world, your doubts, your arguments with yourself, your regrets, your desires. The words you whisper in the dark, they don't belong to you. They belong to whoever's watching. That's not security, that's servitude. Privacy isn't about hiding. It's about dignity, for God's sake. It's about the right to exist without being constantly judged, scored, analyzed, and packaged. Without privacy, you're not a person, you're a product. And your data points in a spreadsheet, your metadata in a database, your raw material to be harvested, categorized, and manipulated. When you encrypt a message, when you shield a part of your life, you're not hiding. You're declaring, this piece belongs to me. That's not paranoia, that's dignity. Think about forgetting. For centuries, forgetting was the default. You said something stupid at a bar, and by morning it was gone. You had a youthful mistake, and it faded into obscurity. Memory was selective, fragile, merciful. Now, nothing is forgotten. A joke you posted at 15 can get you fired at 35. An argument with a lover can be subpoenaed. A location ping on your phone becomes evidence. Forgetting has been replaced with permanence. Privacy is the right to forget. Encryption is the mathematics of forgetting. George Orwell gave us 1984, a world of screens and microphones where the state hears all. But Orwell missed something. Who would volunteer? Who would beg to be surveilled? Who would buy the microphones, install the cameras, carry the tracking devices in our pockets? Franz Kafka wrote The Trial, a story of a man persecuted by a faceless bureaucracy for reasons he never learns. That's today's algorithmic policing. Predictive models flag you as a risk, deny you alone, mark you as suspicious. You never see the reason. You never face your accuser. The system just decides. Michel Foucault described the panopticon, a prison designed where one guard in a tower could watch every inmate. The inmates never knew if they were being watched, so they behaved as if they always were. That's the internet, social media. That's the CCTV on every corner, the phone in every pocket. The uncertainty is the control. Privacy is rebellion against the panopticon. Every culture treats some things as sacred. confession in Catholicism, mystical knowledge in Sufism and Kabbalah, shamanic rituals and indigenous traditions. Secrets aren't sin, they're sanctity. They're the recognition that some knowledge should not be exposed to the crowd, not because it's shameful, but because it's powerful. Modern society has pathologized secrecy. It says if you keep something private, you must be guilty. But in older cultures, secrecy was sacred. Mystery was divine. To encrypt, then, is to restore something ancient. The right to hold a part of yourself away from the marketplace, away from the state and the mob. Transparency has its place. Institutions should be transparent. Governments, corporations, bureaucracies, they should live in the light, because their power affects us all. But individuals? We need shadow. We need rooms with the lights off. We need conversations that vanish into thin air. Transparency for the powerful, privacy for the people. That's the balance. Invert it, as our world has, and you get tyranny. Today we live under the opposite rule. The powerful cloak themselves in secrecy. Classified documents, trade secrets, corporate NDAs. Meanwhile, the powerless are told to live out in the open, monitored, tracked, judged, exposed. That inversion is the essence of control. Cryptography flips it back. It shines light on the institution while giving shadow to the individual. Without privacy, there is no autonomy. Every decision becomes a performance. Every act is filtered through the knowledge that someone is watching. That's not freedom, that's theater. To encrypt is to say, I will not perform. I will not let my choices be dictated by this invisible gaze. I will live unobserved, at least in this corner of my existence. Autonomy is the ability to make mistakes without punishment, to think dangerous thoughts without fear, to love who you love without exposure. Privacy is a soil autonomy grows in. Without it, autonomy dies. Every encrypted message is an act of resistance. Not resistance in the grand revolutionary sense, but in the daily human sense. Resistance against commodification, against surveillance capitalism, against the presumption that your life is open for inspection. You may not be Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, but I don't particularly like Edward Snowden that much anyway. That guy took a specific oath to he signed up for a specific thing, and then he broke that promise. And it's one thing to be a privacy activist, but Stephen Link don't have no contract with the fucking government to do shit. I mean, I went I also went to West Point and take that kind of shit seriously. As much as I'm like a freedom guy, I also value the contracts and agreements I put my name next to. So I'm not just a purist in that aspect. Things are much more nuanced and complicated in the real world. You may not mean a whistleblower leaking classified documents, but when you use encryption, you align with them in spirit. You join the lineage of those who refuse to be transparent cattle. That's the philosophy of privacy, dignity, memory, autonomy, resistance. And once you see encryption not as hiding, but as defending those values, the whole conversation shifts. It stops being about criminals and terrorists, and starts being about what it means to be human in a digital age. But philosophy alone isn't enough. Privacy can't just be individual indulgence, like a lock on your diary. It has to be collective. It has to be culture. Because when only rebels encrypt, encryption looks suspicious. But when everyone encrypts, encryption becomes normal, invisible, and ubiquitous. Privacy isn't selfish, it's solidarity. It's mutual aid. It's the shield we hold up together. Every counterculture begins with rebellion. But the ones that matter, the ones that leave fingerprints on history, they don't stop at rebellion. They build alternatives. The hippies of the 1960s started as dropouts. They left the system. They lived in vans and communes, in shacks in the woods. They dropped acid, listened to guitars howl in fields, burnt draft cards. But the hippies that mattered didn't just escape. They built. Food co-ops, free clinics, underground newspapers, the diggers in San Francisco, handing out free meals to hate. Counterculture became counter-society. Fast forward a decade. The hackers arrive. At first, they look like misfits in basements, soldering wires, writing code, breaking into phone lines with blue boxes. But then they start building. The homebrew computer club, the first personal computers, free software movements. Hackers didn't just rebel against IBM mainframes, they democratized computing. The lineage is clear. The hippies rebelled against empire. The hackers rebelled against corporate computing. The cypherpunks rebelled against surveillance. In the 1990s, a group of mathematicians, programmers, and dreamers gathered on email lists. They called themselves cypherpunks. Their philosophy was simple. Governments and corporations will never voluntarily give you privacy, so we'll build it ourselves. They wrote manifestos. Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. They wrote code, PGP, anonymous remailers, Tor. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask Congress. They didn't lobby the courts. They coded freedom into existence. That's the countercultural spirit. Don't beg, build. Richard Stallman walked in a lab at MIT in the 1980s and saw software being locked away. Code, once shared freely, now property. Closed, restricted, sold. And Stallman declared war. He wrote the GNU Manifesto and said, free as in freedom, not as in beer. Code should be free to use, free to modify, free to share. That wasn't just technical, that was moral. That was the spirit of mutual aid applied to software. Linus Torvalds took that spirit and gave us Linux, open source operating systems, servers that run half the internet today. That was the counterculture becoming infrastructure. And encryption follows that same path. What begins as rebellion, scrambling messages so the feds can't read them, evolves into infrastructure, into something like communities can rely on, like electricity, like water, and libraries. So imagine this. Neighborhoods running their own encrypted mesh networks. Messages bouncing off from rooftop to rooftop, shielded from surveillance, owned by no corporation, governed by no state. Imagine libraries not just lending books, but handing out encryption keys, teaching citizens how to secure their data. Imagine schools where kids don't just learn long division, but learn how to run a Tor node. Imagine churches, mosques, and temples, all offering encrypted spaces for confession and conversation, sacred privacy in a digital age. That's encryption as commons, not paranoia, not crime. Commons, shared infrastructure. Like water fountains provide hydration, like parks provide space to breathe, encryption can provide dignity. Think about it like this. If only activists encrypt, then encryption becomes a flag. The state sees your encrypted traffic and thinks, suspicious. But if everyone encrypts, then encryption disappears into the noise. It becomes normal, invisible. That's solidarity. Every time you send a message on Signal, you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting everyone else who uses it. You're strengthening the herd. Encryption is like herd immunity. If enough people use it, the dragnet fails. The surveillance state drowns in noise. Most countercultures die as protest. They shout, they burn bright, and fade. The ones that last become architecture. They become infrastructure. Punk wasn't just safety pins and mohawks. It was DIY record labels, zines, independent venues, infrastructure. The free speech movement wasn't just shouting on campus. It was underground presses, radical bookstores, alternative schools, infrastructure. Hackers weren't just kids breaking into phone lines. They built Linux, Wikipedia, Mozilla, infrastructure. What will encryption's infrastructure look like? Encrypted hospitals, where patient data can't be sold to corporations. Encrypted unions, where workers can organize without bosses spying. Encrypted cooperatives, where members pool resources without surveillance capitalism skimming the cream. This is what I mean when I say social good. Encryption isn't just about keeping secrets. It's about enabling solidarity. It's about protecting vulnerable communities. It's about building the scaffolding of a new kind of commons. There's a phrase you hear in anarchist circles. Strong communities make police obsolete. The same principle applies here. Strong secrecy makes surveillance obsolete. When we encrypt together, we build solidarity. My encrypted traffic protects yours. Your encrypted message protects mine. Together, we weave a fabric the state cannot easily tear. Secrecy isn't selfish, it's mutual aid. But here's the challenge so far. We've been talking about the individual, communities, and countercultures. What happens when we scale it up? What happens when we take the principles of encryption, proof instead of trust, secrecy for the individual, transparency for the powerful, and apply them not to just neighborhoods, but to institutions? Because if cryptography can protect a dissident, why can't it also protect democracy? We've talked about privacy as rebellion, privacy as dignity, privacy as solidarity. But now we walk into the dangerous question. What if cryptography could do what constitutions once promised, but failed to deliver? Constitutions are meant to be contracts, shields, parchment promises to restrain power. But paper burns, paper lies, paper bends. Words are reinterpreted, loopholes stretched. The ink that declares no unreasonable searches becomes a justification for mass surveillance. The clause that says freedom of speech is twisted into a license for corporations to flood the public square with lies. Written constitutions rely on faith, on men in robes to interpret them, on politicians to honor them. And faith is fragile. Cryptography offers something parchment never could: enforcement. An algorithm doesn't forget. A blockchain doesn't lose its pages. A digital signature doesn't compromise in a smoke-filled back room. What if instead of trusting politicians to respect constitutions, we hardwired them into the code? Take government budgets. Every year, trillions flow through opaque systems. Money disappears. Slush funds emerge. Defense contractors pocket billions for weapons nobody asked for. Imagine if every cent was tracked on a public ledger. Every transaction cryptographically signed. No disappearing billions. No, quote, lost funds. No hidden backroom deals. Anyone could audit it. Anyone could verify. Transparency for the powerful. Privacy for the people. Elections are theater. Ballots counted in back rooms. Results contested in court. Half the population never sure who really won. But imagine elections as cryptographic proofs. Your vote recorded on a ledger. You can verify it. Everyone can. The math doesn't lie. No partisan recounts. No Supreme Court deciding the winner. The algorithm enforces the will of the people. Courts run on evidence. Evidence runs on chains of custody. And chains of custody are fragile. Files get lost. Hard drives disappear. DNA samples are mishandled. But what if every piece of evidence was cryptographically signed the moment it was collected? Its path recorded immutably. No tampering, no disappearing. Truth provable. That's cryptography at institutional scale. Not trust, proof. But here's the complication. Code is cold. Algorithms are rigid. Where does mercy fit? Where does nuance live? Humans bend the rules for compassion, for context. Algorithms enforce without exception. Is that better? Worse? Maybe both. Maybe mercy belongs in people, but limits must be coded into the system so power can expand unchecked. That's the philosophical battlefield. How to balance the rigidity of math with the flexibility of humanity. Think about it. The U.S. Constitution had checks and balances, 3 branches, each restraining the others. That's the theory. In practice, they collude, they bend, they fail. But cryptography can be the new check. Keys distributed so no single actor can act unilaterally. Consensus required, transparency enforced. No president wakes up and decides to bomb a country. Without the keys, without the consensus, the missiles don't fire. The Treasury doesn't release the funds. That's not utopia. That's mathematics restraining empire. Now we leave the theory and step into speculation, into dream, into a thought experiment that could be more than thought. Picture an app, not just an app, a super platform, a digital commons. Call it Monarch X. At its core, Monarch X is a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, but not just another experiment in crypto governance. One hardwired with constitutional principles, not guidelines, not suggestions. Rules that cannot be broken without the keys. Identity verified cryptographically. Votes tallied as proofs. Budgets logged on ledgers. Consensus enforced by code. Transparency for the powerful. Privacy for the people. Let's walk through it. You wake up. You check Monarch X. There's a proposal from your community. Build a new school. You read arguments for and against. You vote. Your vote is signed with your private key, verified by the network. You check later. Your vote is there, immutable, counted. The proposal passes. Funds are released automatically from the Treasury. No politician can reroute them. No middleman can skim them. Contractors are paid as milestones are met. Verified on-chain. The school is built. Later, there's a national issue, a proposed treaty. You participate directly, or you delegate your vote to a representative you trust. The choice is yours. The system enforces it. No lobbyist can bribe it. No judge can overturn it. That's governance reimagined. Public assets, land, funds, resources are managed the same way. Keys distributed, consensus required. Every transaction transparent, every action provable. A president can't sell national parks to corporations in the dead of night. A mayor can't hand contracts to cronies. Without consensus, the system denies it. Power not as promise, but as protocol. Now expand it. Imagine Monarch X adopted by alliances of communities, cities, nations. Budgets coordinated, resources shared. Disputes resolved by verifiable consensus instead of opaque negotiation. The United Nations as it was meant to be, not a forum of speeches and vetoes, but a ledger of proofs and signatures. Of course, critics howl. That is techno-utopianism. This is replacing politics with math. This is tyranny of code. And they're right, no way. Politics is theater. Math is enforcement. If you like the theater, keep watching. But don't pretend the stage isn't rigged. Would you rather live under the tyranny of men who bend every rule to serve themselves, or the tyranny of code that can't be bribed? That's the hard question. That's the uncomfortable choice. But what about tyranny of the majority? If the code enforces whatever the people vote, what protects minorities? The answer? Constitutional code, principles baked in, unalterable, without overwhelming consensus. Rights not written but hardwired. Freedom of speech, of assembly, of conscience, encoded as unbreakable rules. You can't vote away basic dignity. The system refuses. Another critique. What about the digital divide? What about those without access, without literacy, without devices? That's the challenge. Monarch X must be built as public infrastructure, accessible like water, electricity, and roads, taught in schools, distributed freely. Otherwise, it risks becoming just another tool for the elite. That's the danger, and it must be faced head on. Monarch X isn't utopia. It won't solve human greed. It won't stop cruelty, but it will constrain it. It will enforce limits. It will deny corruption the oxygen of secrecy. That's not perfection, that's stability. And stability in a collapsing world is radical. So dream with me. A constitution you can't burn, a democracy you can't buy, a governance you can't corrupt, not because men swear oaths, but because the math refuses. That's Monarch X. We've been swimming in theory, philosophy, and speculation, but let's drop anchor in the real world. Encryption saves lives, not metaphorically, literally. Think about Hong Kong in 2019. Millions marching in the streets. The state wanted names, faces, organizers. Protesters masked their faces, but masks only go so far in a city saturated with cameras. What really mattered was the phones. They encrypted their messages, these apps that burned conversations after minutes. They routed around surveillance with mesh networks when the internet went dark. Without encryption, half of them would be in prison. Think about Belarus, the protest after the stolen election, dictatorships armed with batons, tear gas, and digital surveillance. Encrypted telegram channels became lifelines. Organizers spread news, coordinated marches, evaded police, all in the cover of math. Without encryption, the opposition would have crushed silently, invisibly. We've already seen some next generation illegal weaponry being used on protesters. Once in, I believe it was Belgrade, recently. The only thing stopping things like that are encryption. Or Mexico, journalists there risk death daily. Cartels, corrupt politicians, paramilitary police, all hunting anyone who speaks too loudly. A reporter trying to expose a massacre encrypts her sources. Without it, her source is a corpse. With it, there's a chance, just a chance, that truth reaches the public without blood. Turkey, journalists in jail for tweets. Encryption lets them smuggle the truth out of cells, across borders, into the hands of sympathetic readers. Without it, silence. With it, a whisper survives, like the samizdat for the digital age. But it's not just rebels and reporters. It's you, it's me. Workers tracked by spyware on their laptops. Gig drivers scored by opaque algorithms. Consumers profiled by shopping habits. Students watched by proctoring software in their bedrooms. Parents surveilled by baby monitors that double as corporate microphones. Without encryption, your entire life is a fishbowl. Every word, every breath, every step logged, sold, weaponized. With encryption, you carve out small sanctuaries. A text thread that belongs to you and your lover. A bank transaction that isn't fodder for an ad. A search that doesn't follow you forever. Here's the truth. If only rebels encrypt, then encryption is suspicious. It's a flag. Watch this one. But if everyone encrypts, then encryption is noise, ordinary, invisible. That's herd immunity. Privacy is public health. My encrypted traffic shields yours. Your encrypted email shields mine. Together we drown surveillance in static. Encryption is solidarity. Every time you use it, you protect more than yourself. You protect the principle that secrets belong to people, not just to power. Now let's stare into the fog of tomorrow. First threat, quantum computing. If it arrives in practical form, today's encryption crumbles. RSA, elliptic curves, gone. Doors wide open. Governments salivate at the thought. Hackers too. But cryptographers are already building post-quantum algorithms, lattices, hash-based schemes, code-based proofs. The arm race continues. My own encryption Monarch Zeus has these such features. These post-quantum features. Every lock breeds a new key, every key breeds a new lock. That's the eternal rhythm. Secrecy and surveillance chasing each other, like predator and prey. Second threat, law. Every government drools at the idea of backdoors. They dress it up in noble words. Counterterrorism, quote-unquote, protecting children, or national security. But the reality is blunt. A backdoor for one is a backdoor for all. Once the door exists, anyone can kick it open. The UK tries, quote, lawful access. The US floats the Earn It Act. Australia demands keys. Yet they keep trying, because governments fear citizens with secrets more than they do terrorists with bombs. The third threat is worse: apathy. Shrugging, I've got nothing to hide. The sigh of resignation. The fatigue of endless breaches and leaks. That's how freedom dies. Not with jackboots, but with shrugs. Because surveillance thrives not just on power, but on consent, our willingness to trade privacy for convenience, to click accept, to install the microphone in our kitchens and call it Alexa. But hope lives in math, zero-knowledge proofs, the ability to prove something without revealing the data, homomorphic encryption, computing on data without decrypting it, secure multi-party computation, sharing secrets without exposure, tools that sound like magic but they're real, they're being built, and I'm building them. They're being tested. They're the next frontier of secrecy. So the future is not secure. The future is not hopeless. The future is the same as the past, a battlefield. Surveillance on one side, secrecy on the other. The empire wants everything transparent downward, opaque upward. Cryptography flips it. The war between math and empire never ends, but math has one advantage. Once an idea exists, it can't be erased. You can't ban knowledge. You can't uninvent an algorithm. That's the future, fragile, contested, and alive. Now let's step beyond politics, beyond law, and even beyond technology. Let's drift into the smoke of metaphysics. Every tradition has its mysteries. Gnostics whispered secret teachings. Kabbalists mapped hidden names of God. Sufis spun poetry that spoke only to the initiated. Shamans guarded rituals from outsiders. Secrecy wasn't shame. Secrecy was sacred. Our modern world has inverted this. It treats secrecy as sin. If you're private, you're guilty. If you encrypt, you must be hiding crime. But maybe privacy isn't sin. Maybe it's sanctity. Maybe cryptography is the modern cathedral and the new ritual, the sacrament of the digital age. To keep something private is to declare freedom, to refuse exposure, to say, not everything belongs to you. That's not paranoia. That's metaphysical rebellion. It's the recognition that the self is not for sale, not for inspection, not for judgment. Cryptography is then a spiritual act. Its math is liturgy. Keys as prayer beads. Proofs as scripture. The state wants the opposite. Transparency for you, secrecy for them. But maybe the sacred balance of transparency for the powerful, mystery for the people. Light on the palace, shadow in the home. That's balance. That's justice. So when you encrypt, you're not just hiding. You're participating in something ancient. You're joining the lineage of mystics, rebels, poets, and shamans. You're declaring that your life contains mystery. And mystery, my friends, is holy. We've wandered long, a good half hour, in the smoke, from Caesar to Snowden, from Turing to Tor, from hippies to hackers, from parchment constitutions to algorithmic ones, from solidarity to speculation, politics to metaphysics. So what's left? One truth, one remainder. We live in an age where smoke no longer vanishes. Every word, every step, glance, and every mistake is logged, stored, and remembered, used. Permanence has replaced forgetting, and permanence is prison. But cryptography is the cigarette we light in defiance, the smoke that still vanishes, the whisper that still escapes. It's not perfect, and nothing is, but it's enough to carve out sanctuaries, enough to shield dignity, enough to restrain empire, so that people can fucking live. And if we're bold, if we dare, we can bake our principles into its code. Constitutions that can't be burned, democracies that can't be bought, institutions that cannot betray, because betrayal is mathematically impossible. That's the dream of Monarch X. Not utopia and not salvation, just stability, just dignity, just freedom encoded in proofs. Privacy is freedom. Freedom is secrecy. In the age of the algorithm, secrecy is the only freedom that scales. I exist on an island in the void, surrounded by an empty black, the feminine nothingness. Where I'm thrown into being in an explosion of life, in waves of gratitude, for the chance to breathe and think, to pace around chain smoking in a dark night of the soul, an alchemical transformation of pain into joy. I exist on an island in the void, surrounded by an empty black, the feminine nothingness. I need no other, to sit still and be content with my non-champa burning by my bed, losing myself in good shit, with a conversation with the best minds of history. They keep me company on this journey to the end of night, where the morning awaits in the soft light of victory and seeing a new day. I exist on an island in the void, surrounded by an empty black, the feminine nothingness. I'm looking for my muse, that cosmic other that chases me through fields of agony, in alien dreamscapes to the ends of the earth, laying like dogs in the still of night, and jumping on the bed to nirvana, in manic sessions of playful lust. You're listening to Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man. I'm Stephen Leake. Part 2. If Part 1 was smoke, Part 2 is fire. That's how I think of it. Smoke is what drifts from the end of a burning cigarette, curling into the air, tracing ghosts on the ceiling of a quiet room. Smoke is suggestion. It's philosophy. It's the whisper of rebellion. That was cryptography for the people. Smoke is a symbol of freedom, of secrecy, of the individual holding on to some private corner of the world in an era when surveillance wants to drag every last shadow into the light. But smoke can only carry you so far. Smoke vanishes, it lingers in the lungs, it stings the eyes, but it doesn't build anything. Smoke reminds us we're alive, but it doesn't give us shelter. Fire is different. Fire is structure, it's transformation. Fire melts the iron, shapes the brick, burns away the old and makes room for the new. Fire is coded permanence, and so Part 2 is fire. The pivot is simple, but it cuts deep. In Part 1 we said privacy is rebellion, secrecy is survival, and cryptography is the one weapon they can't confiscate. But rebellion isn't enough. If you want to live beyond resistance, you need architecture. You need a system. Privacy is the inhale, but governance is the exhale. So this time, the question is not how to vanish, but how to live together in the open without becoming slaves. What would a society look like if the Constitution were not written on parchment, not declared by politicians with their hands in the pockets of lobbyists, not enforced by men with badges and guns, but coded into the very infrastructure of life? What if rules were not broken promises, but lines of execution that cannot be bribed, cannot be intimidated, and cannot be swayed? That's the dream of Monarch X. In Part 1 we called it a dream. A dream because secrecy is a kind of dreaming, a refuge where you imagine life on your own terms. But now Monarch X begins to harden, to crystallize, to burn like fire. It's no longer a dream, but a blueprint, a set of constitutional codes. It's already written, folks. It's in a stack on my desk. It's in my emails. It's on my computer. It's an operating system for society. And beyond Monarch X comes the next evolutionary layer, the Monarch Zeus Protocol, lightning to the fire, a meta-constitution that governs not only the rules, but the rules about changing rules. Fire then, lightning, structure, then transcendence. But before we reach Zeus, before we talk about lightning striking across continents, we have to start with something humbler. How have people tried to organize themselves, and with every form of organization so far has ended in failure, because that is not the new question, it's not a new question. Humans have been trying to govern themselves since the first tribes sat around a fire, dividing meat, deciding who gets to hide, who leads the hunt, and who speaks for the dead. The question of how to bind people together without being consumed by corruption is the oldest question in civilization, and every answer we've tried is cracked. Think about tribes, small groups bound by blood and ritual. Trust is high when everyone knows everyone. Corruption is low because shame is immediate. Punishment is visible. Exile means death. But scale is impossible. Tribes fracture, tribes war. And when tribes grow too large, trust breaks down. You get chiefs, shamans, monarchs, the first kings. Power concentrates, and with it comes betrayal. Monarchies give you order, and they give you continuity, but they also give you tyranny. Bloodlines rule regardless of competence, and the people are subjects, not participants. The dream of the Republic was supposed to fix that. Representation, checks and balances, the promise that law would outlast men. Yet republics fell to demagogues, to emperors in disguise. The Roman Senate gave way to Caesar. The American Republic has become a corporate oligarchy, with a hollow shell of democracy still flickering on its screens. And then came corporations, strange new entities that are not people, not nations, but legal fictions with the rights of immortals and the morality of predators. Corporations became the new sovereigns, shaping laws instead of obeying them. They taught us that governance doesn't need armies, when you can control supply chains and bank accounts. And we still believed in them, or at least we tolerated them, because they gave us the products, the jobs, and networks we wanted. But trust was shattered again and again. Scandals, fraud, exploitation, environmental collapse, workers ground down for shareholder profit. So here we are, tribes too small, monarchies too corrupt, republics too fragile, corporations too soulless. Every experiment has failed. The pattern is always the same. Human trust doesn't scale. Corruption creeps in at every opening. Leaders turn into tyrants, laws turn into loopholes, institutions rot, and the dreams of honest governance faces into cynicism. But what if its trust itself could be coded? What if you could replace leaders with algorithms, promises with smart contracts, constitutions with immutable code? That is the idea of the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, a strange phrase, heavy on jargon, but at its core, it means something radical. Rules enforced by code, not by rulers. Governance without governors. Democracy without politicians. Imagine an organization where you don't need a treasurer, because the treasury is controlled by smart contracts. No one can embezzle because the code won't allow it. Imagine a collective where decisions are not carried out by committees, but executed automatically once a vote passes. Imagine a system where transparency is built in, every vote, every transaction visible on a public ledger, not hidden behind closed doors. That's the promise of DAOs. And they already exist. Primitive, flawed, and fragile, but real. Early Ethereum experiments showed us both the dream and the nightmare. The DAO, the first great experiment, raised over $100 million in Ether back when that was an unimaginable sum for a decentralized venture. It was supposed to be the future of venture capital, collective decision making, pooled resources, distributed ownership. But then came the hack. A flaw in the code allowed an attacker to drain millions, and because the rules were code, not law, the attacker argued he hadn't stolen anything. He had simply executed the contract as written. It was a philosophical crisis. If code is law, then the hack was legal. If code is law, then bugs were laws too. Ethereum had to decide, honor the sanctity of the code, or fork the blockchain to undo the theft. In the end, they forked a political decision, not a coded one. Proof that even in the world of DAOs, human judgment still lurks behind the curtain. But the idea did not die. Maker DAO emerged, creating decentralized stablecoin backed by collateral, governed by token holders. It was messy, technical, but it showed that a financial institution could exist entirely on-chain, without a board of directors, without a central bank. Then came city DAOs, experiments in running local communities through tokens and smart contracts. Cooperatives reinvented themselves as DAOs, letting members vote transparently on budgets, on projects, on leadership, and new hybrids sprouted everywhere, from art collectives to investment clubs to decentralized media. Still, the cracks remain. Participation is low. Token voting concentrates power in Wales. Governance apathy mirrors the voter apathy of the old world, and yet something is different. Because in DAOs, corruption is not systemic, it is technical. A bug, not a betrayal, a failure of code, not of trust. That shift matters. It means institutions are no longer subject to the whims of charismatic leaders or corrupt bureaucrats. They are subject only to the quality of their code, and code can be audited, tested, and improved. So maybe DAOs are the proto-institutions of the digital age, primitive tribes of the blockchain era, gathering around not fires but ledgers, not shamans but developers. Imperfect, yes. Vulnerable, yes. But perhaps the first step toward organizations that did not collapse under their own corruption. Organizations that scale trust not by faith, not by force, but by cryptographic certainty. That is the fire we are playing with now. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because the DAOs can run an art collective or a co-op or a financial protocol. Why can't they run a city? Why can't they run a nation? Why can't they become the architecture of governance itself? If smoke was the manifesto, then fire is the constitution, and the DAOs are the first sparks on the ground. All right, we're rolling into 2. Law was always supposed to be the great equalizer. That was the promise, that men would not rule men directly, but through words written down, words carved into stone, words etched on parchment, words printed in statutes. If the law said a thing, it would bind even the king, that no man would be above it, and no poor soul beneath its protection. But words are slippery. Anyone who has spent time in a courtroom knows this. Language bends, language twists. A single phrase can mean one thing in the hands of the defense, another in the mouth of the prosecution, and something else entirely in the ruling of a judge who owes his position to favors whispered in private halls. Law is human prose, and prose is full of ambiguity, full of loopholes. That's why lawyers exist. That's why the rich always seem to win, because ambiguity is a battlefield, and those with money, more influence, and more patience to drag a case through the courts, they own that battlefield. Law is supposed to be neutral, but has always been a game played by the powerful. Enter smart contracts. The idea is simple but radical. What if law was not written in prose, but drafted by politicians and interpreted by judges, but written in code? What if the execution of a rule was not left to the discretion of a man in a robe, but carried out automatically, inexorably by the blockchain? A contract that says if this, then that, and that it happens. No excuses, no delays or corruption. The moment the conditions are met, the rule executes. A digital hammer falls, and there's no appeal, no jury, no mercy. Just law as code. On one hand, that's terrifying. On the other, it's liberating. Because prose gives us loopholes. Prose gives us corruption. But prose also gives mercy. A judge can look at a starving man who stole a loaf of bread and say, the law says guilty, but justice says free. Code cannot do that. Code is merciless. If the condition is met, the action follows, no exceptions. And yet maybe this mercilessness is exactly what we need. Because history has shown us the danger of merciless rulers, men without restraint, men who bend the law to their will. Better to have merciless rules than merciless rulers. Look at how smart contracts have already reshaped the world. In decentralized finance, or DeFi, billions move every day without banks, without brokers, without middlemen. Lending protocols let strangers across the globe loan each other money with no trust required, no signatures, no notaries, no legal system to enforce repayment. The collateral is locked by code, released only when conditions are met. The law is the contract is the code. In supply chains, smart contracts track goods as they move from one country to another, automating payments, verifying authenticity, reducing the human friction of paperwork and customs fraud. In art, royalties are embedded directly into tokens, ensuring that every time a piece is resold, the original artist receives their cut automatically. No need for lawyers to chase galleries, no need for accountants to fudge numbers. The code makes it happen. But the implications go further. Imagine smart contracts governing everyday life, micro-governance at the edge. Imagine neighborhoods where utilities are paid automatically when usage hits certain levels. No bills, no late fees, no bureaucratic errors. Imagine cooperatives where work contributions are logged transparently and rewards flow instantly according to agreed rules. Imagine elections where votes are cast as transactions, instantly counted, instantly verifiable, impossible to falsify. And if you take the metaphor seriously, The Constitution itself is just a giant contract, a set of rules, rights, and obligations. The difference is that constitutions are written in prose, interpreted endlessly, amended when political winds shift. But what if a constitution was a smart contract, hard-coded, transparent, unalterable, except by rules agreed upon in advance? No Supreme Court twisting phrases to mean whatever they meant, what they never meant. No senators quietly ignoring the text when it suits them. Just law as execution. Imagine a First Amendment written not on paper, but as code that literally prevents censorship at the protocol level. Imagine a budget transparency enforced by contracts that simply cannot move funds without public consensus. Imagine due process, not as a promise, but as an algorithm. Of course, there are dangers. Code is brittle and bugs can be catastrophic. We already saw this with the first great DAO hack. A single overlooked flaw drained millions, and the system nearly collapsed. And unlike prose, code cannot be argued with. You can't plead your case to a bug. You can't appeal to a jury for compassion. The contract executes, even if the outcome is absurd or unjust. That is the dark side of automation. A system too rigid to bend becomes a system that shatters. But then think of the alternative. Parchment constitutions have failed us again and again. They are interpreted to death, amended beyond recognition, ignored when inconvenient. Politicians swear oaths to uphold them, and then betray them at the first opportunity. Paper burns, promises bend, men betray. Code, at least, has the possibility of remaining. It may be merciless, but it is incorruptible. And if incorruptibility is the goal, perhaps mercy can be reintroduced later, not in the base layer, but a human layer built on top. Hybrid sovereignty of code and conscience. That's why smart contracts matter, not just as financial tools, not just as supply chain gimmicks, but as a philosophical prototype of a new kind of law. Law that is execution, not suggestion. Law that is transparent, not obfuscated. Law that does not bend for the powerful, because it cannot bend at all. We are watching the birth of algorithmic constitutions, and once that door opens, it will not close, because once you see a law as code, you realize that every system we have is just a brittle simulation of what code can already do better. The old world is already creaking. Legal systems are overwhelmed. Bureaucracies are bloated. Courts clogged with cases that drag on for years. People don't trust the law anymore. They see it as a game rigged against them, a system that cannot win. And into that void steps the idea of contracts that execute themselves, of constitutions that enforce themselves, of organizations that do not rely on trust at all. This is the fire catching hold. DAOs were the sparks. Smart contracts are the logs. Together they create the blaze that can burn down the old world of paper and politicians and build something incorruptible in its place. Constitutions were supposed to be the chains we placed on power. That was the dream. That no matter who rose to rule, they would be bound by the text, limited by the articles, restrained by the rights of the people who written into law. But parchment is weak, ink fades, and words bend. A constitution is only strong as the men who interpret it, and men are corruptible. Then they tell you the Constitution is unalterable, sacred, the foundation of the Republic. But every time it becomes inconvenient, it gets amended, ignored, and reinterpreted into something unrecognizable. The parchment doesn't protect you, it never has. It just gives you the illusion of protection, while the powerful rewrite its meaning behind closed doors. Think of the American Constitution. For centuries it has been worshipped as scripture, as if the founders were prophets, as if the texts they wrote were divine. And yet, slavery lived comfortably under its shadow. Segregation thrived. Wars were declared without declarations. Surveillance metastasized despite guarantees of privacy. Freedom of speech is quoted like gospel while platforms censor at will and governments pressure them into silence. The parchment didn't fail because it was badly written. It failed because it was human. Because every right can be twisted by interpretation, every limit on government can be eroded by time, every clause can be bent until it breaks. Now, imagine a constitution not written in prose, but encoded into algorithms, not interpreted by judges, but executed by machines, immutable, incorruptible, and automatic. A system where budgets cannot be hidden because every transaction must be verified by the network. A system where freedom of speech is not a vague phrase, but an enforced principle of the architecture itself. No node, no server, no authority can silence a voice, because the code does not allow it. This is constitutional code. But the question is always the same. What do you hard code? And why? And what do you leave flexible? Because life is not static. Societies evolve, needs shift, technologies change, the very definition of rights. If you make a constitution too rigid, it becomes a cage. If you make it too flexible, it becomes meaningless. That is the paradox of living code. It must endure, but it must also adapt. How do you encode permanence without encoding stagnation? How do you design a system that cannot be corrupted but can still grow? Maybe the answer is layers. The base layer is merciless, unalterable, fundamental, the thing that must never change. Freedom of expression, transparency of governance, due process, the inviolability of personhood. These are not negotiable. They're not subject to interpretation. They're the granite bedrock. Above them, you build layers of flexibility, rules that can be amended through consensus, protocols that can evolve through democratic processes encoded in advance, but the base remains untouched. The way you preserve the possibility of growth without risking the decay of the foundation. Better merciless rules than merciless rulers. That phrase keeps circling in my head, because we've seen what merciless rulers do. They bend the rules to their will, crush dissident, manipulate institutions until they are nothing more than staged props. Merciless rulers, on the other hand, merciless rules, on the other hand, are indifferent. They do not care who you are, how powerful, how rich. If the condition is met, the rule executes. If not, it doesn't. Cold, precise, incorruptible. Yes, that can be cruel. Yes, that can lack compassion. But cruelty from rules is at least predictable. Cruelty from men is arbitrary, vindictive, and personal. Between the two, I will take the merciless rule. Think about how budget transparency could work in constitutional code. Right now, governments hide their spending behind endless bureaucratic jargon, opaque line items, shadowy budgets. Citizens have no real visibility into where their money goes. But in a coded constitution, every tax dollar could be tracked on-chain, visible in real time. No minister could funnel money into private pockets. No general could hide slush funds for secret wars. The ledger itself enforces transparency. Or think about voting. In the old world, elections are marred by gerrymandering, suppression, and fraud. In confidence, in a coded system, every vote is recorded on-chain, immutable, instantly countable, verified by anyone. The legitimacy of the system comes not from trust in institutions, but from the code itself. Of course, skeptics will say, this is fantasy, that code can be hacked, that developers are just new priests, that bugs will undermine the very guarantees we claim. And they are not wrong. But compared to the present, constitutions are hacked every day by politicians who twist their meaning. Developers can be audited. Bugs can be patched. Human corruption cannot. That is the difference. That is why constitutional code is not just a dream, but a necessity. And yet we must acknowledge the risk of rigidity. What if the code forbids something that society later decides it needs? What if the unalterable rules become a prison? That is why the higher layers must exist, recursive consensus mechanisms that allow for change, but only according to processes that themselves are incorruptible, not a judge's interpretation, and not a politician's whim, but a meta rule, a protocol for change that ensures the system can evolve without collapsing into corruption. This is the balance, permanence at the core and adaptability at the edges. We stand at the edge of the possibilities. Monarch X is the name I give to this architecture, not just an application and not just a platform, but the operating system of society. It is a place where constitutional code can live, where the fire of rules enforced by algorithms can replace the fragile illusions of parchment and prose. It is radical, it is frightening, but it is also the only way forward, because the old constitutions have already failed. We are just living in the aftermath, pretending they still hold. This is the point where smoke truly turns fully into fire, where the dream of privacy becomes the reality of governance, where the manifesto becomes the architecture. And once the architecture is built, it does not just resist corruption, it becomes a foundation for something entirely new, a society not bound by leaders, but by law that cannot be broken, a constitution not written but compiled. Monarch X is not just an app, it's not a platform. It's not a startup looking for venture capital. It's something larger, something much stranger, something more dangerous. Monarch X is an operating system for society, a super platform that does not just host services, but encodes the rules of life itself. Imagine if the Constitution and the government and the economy and the legal system were not separate institutions, not rival powers fighting for influence, but one unified structure of code. That is Monarch X. is not just a network you log on to, it's the framework through which identity, governance, and economy or justice are conducted. It is a state without a state, a nation without borders, a constitution without politicians. The question everyone asks is identity. How do you prove who you are without creating a surveillance nightmare? Monarch X answers with cryptographic personhood. Not an ID in your wallet, not a biometric scan stored in a government database, but a cryptographic proof that you are unique, you are human, that you are the same person who voted yesterday or received funds last week without revealing anything else about you. Zero knowledge proofs, decentralized identifiers, web of trust attestations. The technical details may shift, but the principle is the same. You exist in the system as a verified person, but no one owns your data. You are not tracked, you are not profiled, you are not reduced to a set of surveillance metrics for some corporate advertiser or security agency. You are simply a cryptographic being, sovereign, unforgettable, untouchable. Once you have an identity, you can have governance. But governance in Monarch X is not the crude ballot box democracy of the nation state. It is richer, more experimental, more fluid. Liquid democracy lets you delegate your vote to someone you trust, but reclaim it at any time. Quadratic voting lets you signal not just yes or no, but intensity, weighting issues by strength of preference rather than by blunt tally of numbers. Citizen assemblies can be drawn by algorithmic lottery, rotating representation to avoid the stagnation of professional politicians. Every vote is on-chain, transparent, and verifiable. Every process is encoded in the open. Corruption has nowhere to hide. And then comes the treasury. In the old world, budgets are black holes. Money disappears into programs no one understands, siphoned into private contracts, diverted into secret projects. In Monarch X, the treasury is cryptographically secure. Every inflow, every outflow, every allocation visible to all. Citizens can track the exact path of their contributions. Collective decisions on budgets are executed automatically. If people vote to fund a public good, the smart contract releases the funds directly. No middleman, no opportunity for embezzlement. Transparency is not a promise, it is a mechanism. Dispute resolution is another cornerstone. In the old world, courts were slow, expensive, biased, and riddled with politics. In Monarch X, justice is algorithmic, but not inhuman. Smart contract courts resolve basic disputes automatically. Was the payment made? Was the service delivered? For more complex issues, verifiable juries are selected randomly from the network, incentivized to rule fairly through cryptographic staking. Decisions are recorded immutably. Appeals are possible, but limited by rules encoded in advance. Justice becomes faster, cheaper, more transparent. And while skeptics fear the machines cannot deliver fairness, one must ask, has a human system ever delivered fairness, or has it only delivered privilege for those who can afford the lawyers and the time? The beauty of Monarch X is scalability. It does not matter whether you are a neighborhood co-op deciding how to manage a community garden, or a city deciding how to allocate resources, or a nation-state governing millions. The same architecture applies. The same cryptographic personhood, the same transparent treasury, the same liquid democracy, the same dispute resolution. The only difference is scale. It is modular governance, scalable governance, fractal governance, a single framework that can host both the tiniest associations and largest societies. Of course, the critics are legion. They say it is technocracy, that only the technically literate will understand the rules, and thus power will shift from the politicians to developers. They would say it will deepen the digital divide, leaving the poor disconnected, the uneducated outside the system. They say it will become the tyranny of the majority, a brutal algorithmic mob crushing minorities without the protection of nuanced human judgment. And those critiques may not be wrong. They are warnings and reminders of dangers, but they are not reasons to stop. Because the current systems are already technocracies in disguise. The poor already are excluded, and minorities are already crushed. At least with Monarch X, the system is transparent, open to audit, open to improvement. You can fork it. You cannot fork a corrupt parliament. And perhaps the final argument, Monarch X is not monolithic, it is forkable. If you disagree with the way your community is governed, you can copy the code, modify it, and start a new community. You didn't have to beg for reforms from entrenched elites. You didn't have to march in the streets hoping for change. You fork, you leave, you build anew. That is sovereignty in the digital age, not protest, but exit, not revolution, but replication. Every fork is a test, every fork an experiment, every fork a chance to discover a better configuration. Over time, the best constitutions will survive, and the worst will fade. Evolutionary governance, survival of the most just. That is why I call Monarch X the super platform, because it is not a single app, not a single DAO, and not a single chain of contracts. It is the ecosystem itself, the soil from which countless governance experiments can grow, the operating system of society, open source and incorruptible, scalable and adaptable, ruthless in execution but infinite in possibility. It is not utopia and it is not perfection. It is simply the next layer, the fire that consumes the old and makes room for the new. If Monarch X is fire, then Zeus is lightning. Fire is structure, controlled, slow, the architecture of survival. Lightning is sudden, overwhelming, and planetary. Fire builds society, lightning connects societies, strikes across borders, and fuses the whole world in one field. The Monarch Zeus protocol is not just another layer, it is the layer above layers. If Monarch X is constitutional enforcement, Zeus is meta-governance, the rules for upgrading rules, the architecture for change itself. The problem is ancient. Quis custode ipso custodies? Who watches the watchmen? Who governs the governors? Every constitution has wrestled with it, and every constitution has failed. Checks and balances are fragile. Oversight committees become rubber stamps, and watchdogs get captured by the very powers they are supposed to restrain. The guardians always end up guarding themselves. But Zeus is different. Zeus solves the paradox with recursion. The rules for changing rules are themselves encoded. Consensus governs not only the laws, but the evolution of the laws. There's no secret committee and no shadow elite. The system that upgrades Monarch X is itself transparent, distributed, and incorruptible. Think of Zeus as digital lightning, fast, global, and immutable. When societies need change, when crisis demands adaptation, Zeus channels the energy without destroying the structure. Monarch X is the fire burning steadily in the hearth, keeping the house alive. Zeus is the strike in the storm, the flash that rewrites the sky. Together they create a living system. Fire for continuity, lightning for transformation. Consider global problems that nation-states have failed to solve. Climate accords, negotiated endlessly. Promises broken the moment oil profits are threatened. Trade wars erupting despite treaties. Refugees stranded because borders are sacred while human life is disposable. And vice versa. Monarch X could organize nations internally, but without Zeus, coordination between nations remains impossible. Zeus becomes the scaffolding for planetary constitution, a meta layer where rules are agreed upon, enforced automatically, and upgraded only through recursive consensus. Imagine a global climate accord, written not as treaty but as code, emission limits hard-coded, monitored in real time through sensors feeding the chain, penalties executed automatically. But I mean, that would have to be worked out. Funds withdrawn from treasuries the moment targets are missed, redistributed to nations most affected by rising seas or droughts. That would impede on more things that I'm willing to go into right now. But that's just possible and things that we need to work out. Resource distribution too. The rivers that cross borders, the fisheries that span oceans, and atmospheres we all share, are all commons that nations plunder for themselves. With Zeus, agreements can be coded at the planetary level. One nation overfishes, penalties flow automatically. If another preserves, rewards are distributed. The rules are not subject to corruption of local politics. They are global, immutable, and enforced by the system itself. Skeptics will call it impossible. They say that no nation would surrender sovereignty to a code, but sovereignty is already eroding. I would insist on this being done at the nation state, though. I'd be very wary of it going global, even though it could. Pandemics and climate disasters, which I would argue are probably not even real. It's just an example of the possibility that exists for this code. And, being the one who has man birthed it into existence, I will tell you what it's capable of. And once I make it, once it's out, I'm giving the full product spec, and you could use this. You could scale it all the way up to a planetary system. Is that a good idea? I don't know. This is the dream, a planetary constitution, not enforced by armies, not manipulated by elites, but compiled into existence. Monarch X governs the community. Zeus governs the governs. Together they form the skeleton of a civilization that does not rot from within. Fire and lightning, structure and strike, continuity and change. Maybe that is what humanity has always lacked. Not ideals and not constitutions, but not declarations, but an incorruptible mechanism for keeping those ideals alive. Paper burns and men betray. Promises bend. But lightning, once it strikes, leaves its mark in the very ground. Fire, once it takes hold, reshapes the world around it. The Monarch Zeus protocol is not utopia, it's not perfection. It is simply the next layer. A system that says no more blind faith in leaders, no more fragile treaties, and no more constitutions that collapse under interpretation. I would prefer this be used to have a constitutional government throughout, not just an excuse for kind of global shit. That is lightning, that's Zeus. Let's finish it. For all the talk of fire and lightning, we cannot forget flesh. We cannot forget that society is not only code, and not only rules, not only ledgers and protocols, it's people. People full of contradictions, full of impulses, full of needs that an algorithm can predict. A constitution written in code may protect us from corruption, but it cannot teach us mercy, it cannot forgive, and it cannot love. That is the human element, and it is what must not be lost. Think about justice. A smart contract can settle whether a payment was made, whether a service was delivered. It can weigh intention. Can it see the mother who stole medicine for her child, not as the thief, but as desperate love? Can it forgive a mistake, offer a second chance? Code cannot do that. Code is merciless. Execution without exception. That is both its strength and its failure, because human societies cannot live without grace, without the ability to look at each other and say, yes, you broke the rule, but I understand why. Yes, you failed, but I forgive you. Without that, we are machines pretending to be alive. So the question is how to reintroduce humanity into algorithmic constitutions, how to design a system that is incorruptible at its core, but flexible enough to allow compassion at its edges. One answer is hybrid sovereignty. The base rules are code, unbreakable and incorruptible, but above them exists a layer of human judgment. Panels, juries, assemblies that can override the machine in rare, clearly defined circumstances. Not politicians with limitless discretion, but humans operating within transparent boundaries. Grace is a controlled exception, not as a loophole to be exploited. Another answer is to encode forgiveness itself, to design contracts that allow for rehabilitation, a rule that does not banish forever but sets a path back, a system where penalties decay, where rights lost can be regained through restitution, and through time, through demonstrated change, not mercy as a personal favor, but mercy as a systemic principle. The code may be merciless in execution, but the system can still allow for redemption. We must never forget the code is a tool, not a soul. It can protect us from corruption, but it cannot tell us who we are. It can enforce justice, but it cannot give us meaning. That meaning must come from us, from our culture and our stories, our art, our love, our capacity to forgive each other, where no machine would. If we forget that, we will build a perfect system and still feel empty inside. And maybe that is the final lesson. Fire can burn the old away. Lightning can rewrite the sky. But we are still human, fragile, mortal, contradictory. We need rules, yes, but we also need dreams. We need incorruptibility, but we also need compassion. The future is not a machine. The future is not a chain of blocks or a web of protocols. The future is us, flawed, yearning, and searching. And the best code can do is give us the skeleton of a civilization strong enough to hold our weight without collapsing under corruption. So let me leave you with this. Paper burns, promises bend, men betray, but code remains. That is not salvation, and that is not utopia. That is simply a foundation, a skeleton. Fire for structure, lightning for change, flesh for meaning. Together, maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The dream of Monarch X and the Zeus protocol is not perfection. It is not the end of the history. It is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a new experiment. A civilization compiled instead of written. A society where rules are not suggestions but execution. Where transparency is enforced. Where corruption is made impossible. And yet, within that structure, we must still find space for forgiveness, for love, and for grace. Hybrid sovereignty. Code plus conscience. Fire plus heart. The future is not written, it is compiled, and the compiler is us. Every choice we make, every line of code we deploy, every fork we create, every consensus we reach, that is the compilation. And when the smoke clears, when the fire burns steady, when the lightning etches its mark into the earth, perhaps we will have built something new, something worthy, not a utopia and not perfection, but a society that does not collapse under its own corruption, a society that endures. That is the musing, whispered through smoke, drifting into the night. Fire, lightning, flesh, Monarch X, Zeus protocol, the skeleton of a new civilization. The dream continues. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight. That was quite a doozy. I even admit that. Thanks for listening to Cryptography for the People on Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. Again, I'm Stephen Leake. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight. We're gonna win.
These days of chaos, the Constitution is the answer. In unrest and riots, the Constitution is the answer. When propaganda flows, when monopolies rage, when bad is good and up is down, the Constitution is the answer. The way out is tried and true, the birthright of all citizens. Freedom is good for you, man. Freedom is good for you.